You got an interview. Wait a second. I know exactly how you're feeling. I'm a psychologist, so I'm a mind reader, of course. Okay, so I'm sensing a little bit of excitement for sure, but also maybe mixed in with a little bit of ah! Did I get it right? Not surprising. Well, don't worry, I've got you. But first, hello. My name is Miranda and I'm a second-year trainee clinical psychologist, and today I'm going to be laying out my top 10 tips to help you prepare for interview so that you can later
annihilate them.
So I will be drawing on my experiences of interviewing for the Clinical Psychology Doctorate. However, I think this advice really can be applied to any interview. It's that tasty. But anyway, I know you're a busy person, you got places to be, you got people to see. So let's get right into it with my tip number 1. Try to replicate the interview conditions when you're practicing. It's okay, I'm going to explain what I mean, don't panic. So when you get invited to interview, you're usually sent some information about what that interview setup is going to be like. So, for example, am I going to be interviewed by one person? Is it going to be a panel? Is it going to be via Zoom? Is it going to be via the telephone? Now, each interview setup is going to bring with it its own unique set of challenges. And it's really important to try and practice within the same format so that you don't get any nasty surprises that are going to throw you off your game. Let me give you an example. For my very first interview for the Clinical Psychology Doctorate, I was interviewed by a panel of 4. Now, I had only ever practiced being interviewed by one person, and let me tell you, having 8 eyeballs looking at you all at once, waiting for answers, is very different to just the very friendly 2 eyeballs. And because of this, before I'd even been asked any questions, my anxiety went through the roof, my heart was in my stomach, and I really couldn't focus on what I was being asked. In retrospect, if I had practiced the setup a little bit more, I wouldn't have been so freaked out by the interview situation and had a little bit more headspace to actually focus on the questions. Which I think is a really good point to bring in interview tip number 2. Practice with the interviewer from hell. Just like the interview scenario, the interviewers themselves can massively throw you off your game. Basically, these first 2 tips are about trying to become an indestructible, unflappable, psychological ninja so that you can zone out everything that isn't important when it comes to interviewing. So my very first panel looked something like this. Seriously. Everything about them, their non-verbal, their faces, told me,
honey, it's time to wrap this up, move it along and get out.
And it's actually really hard to keep talking when you're speaking to essentially a brick wall. My second panel, honestly, it was like they had planned this. Everything I said, they were looking at each other going, like ferociously writing things down halfway through my sentences when I hadn't even said anything intelligent. And it was so incredibly distracting that I kept losing my train of thoughts. And I'm not saying this to freak you out because I've had some very lovely, encouraging, in a normal way, interviewers. But the chances are you are going to encounter someone who knowingly or unknowingly is going to make your life difficult. So it's a good idea to practice this. Practice with someone who gives you nothing, gives you too much, interrupts you, or if you're ready for level 2, maybe an interviewer who actually undermines you. Then nothing is going to get in your way. My third bit of advice would be to get your house in order. And by this I mean, have a bit of a think of the things that you would like to say in response to some of the more generic questions which you're likely to come up against. So for example, for the DClinPsy, it's usually a good idea to have a clinical case that you can talk about and a bit of research that you were involved in that you can discuss. There are some other questions which I will write in the description box below, but to be honest, I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on these because in my experience, you only ever get 1 or 2 of these generic questions pop up, and it's always the things that you don't prepare for that you end up being asked about. However, it is a good move to have some ideas formulated for these kinds of questions because in my experience, if you get asked something basic and you start tripping up over yourself, you're gonna look like a bit of a doofus. So it's good to have a few things planned out. In the same vein, my fourth tip would be to know your current issues. Now, I'm going to put my hands up. I'm not the best at staying on top of these things. And if you're in that camp as well, it's okay. Don't worry. We can do a little bit of research before our interview to understand some of the issues which are affecting people and the profession more generally. So the big ones that spring to mind would be discussions around racism, around diversity, and the global pandemic. To be honest, I wouldn't really try to memorize anything big or fancy, because when you get to interview, you're gonna be nervous. And if you don't know the topic inside out and you're trying to regurgitate something fancy in the interview room, you're probably gonna tie yourself up in knots and just confuse yourself. So keep it simple. As with your preparation for the more generic questions, I think it's just a nice idea to brainstorm a couple of ideas so you've got a plan laid out, but you're not too formulaic when the time comes. Tip 5 would be to dress like a boss. Now, interviews are one of the best opportunities you have to upgrade your life, so do not attend looking crusty. I know formal wear can be expensive. This does not need to break the bank. We just need to say hello to our affordable friends of the high street fashion brands. Or maybe you can even borrow a little thing or two from your friend who works in finance. Also, formal wear doesn't need to be a suit and tie vibe. In my interview where I got on, I went with some very, very cute wide-legged spotty trousers and this blouse which had a kind of frills down the front, kind of like what you'd imagine a flamenco dancer to be wearing if she had an office job. And this was intentional. I wanted the gods of Latin spice to be with me in the interview. So if you want to show a little bit of personality through your clothes, that's okay. Just remember, no crust allowed. My tip 6 would be to use your first 10 seconds well. Before you get into the interview, there's usually going to be a bit of preamble, you know, where they ask you how you are, etc., etc. This is where the first impression is made. Use it well. In my very first interview, I was nervous. I didn't know if I was trying to be cute or endearing or what, but when I was asked how I was just like,
Hello, I'm okay. I'm a bit nervous.
which is fine, but actually looking back, if I'd given some thought of how I wanted to handle that question, that isn't the version of myself that I really wanted to put across. In the interview where I did actually manage to get a place, when I was asked that question, I was all, yeah, I'm great. I'm really excited to be here. Who are you gonna hire? Is it that girl? Or is it this girl? It's this girl. Tip 7 would be to stop speaking. When you're in the interview, in the nicest possible way, just shut your mouth. When you're practicing, just get yourself into a habit of giving yourself a couple of seconds after the question has been asked to think about what you're going to say. Obviously, this does not apply if they ask you something like, can you confirm your name and date of birth? Because they're going to worry about you if you're like... But otherwise, a little bit of silence can help you to get your thoughts in order. In my very first interview, I really wanted to sound like fluent and knowledgeable, so as soon as I was asked something, I would just launch into my answer, which meant that 30 seconds in, I was kind of like,
I don't know where I'm going with this.
which just made everything come out a little bit jumbled. So if you get yourself into the practice of being comfortable with silence, you can be a little bit more strategic about your answers and actually think about what you want to say. My next tip would be to show your workings out. Now, in every interview, there are going to be some stretch questions. These are questions which they're not necessarily expecting you to have an answer for, but they kind of want to see how you approach things and how you can think critically. Now, I think the temptation for these questions is only to say the things that you were definitely sure about, which is exactly what I did. Unfortunately, for that question, there wasn't actually all that much that I was sure about, so I ended up saying not a lot and moved on to the next question very quickly. I think there I really missed an opportunity to show my thought process, to show some of the things that I was weighing up, the things that I was considering. Surprisingly, interviewers aren't telepathic, so unless you spell it out for them, put it on the table, they're not going to know all the interesting things that are happening in your head. Showing your workings out not only shows them what you do know, but also how you can approach a challenge and how you can think critically. Granted, there are going to be some stretch questions which are just beyond one's capability, which brings me on to tip number 9. So my tip number 9 would be to have an action plan in place for when your mind goes blank or you just do not know the answer. It's probably going to happen. It's okay. Like for one of my interviews, I was asked to talk about a statistical test on the spot for a research project that I designed in the interview, and I was literally like, ah! But luckily I had a bit of a strategy in place so that I could deal with that situation calmly. I think more often than not, the interviewers know that you're probably not going to know the answer to these kinds of questions. They just want to see how you cope under pressure. So in my situation, I literally just responded, do you know what? I actually have no idea. And we moved on. We just moved on to the next question. And it was fine. The world did not implode. So I think try and come up with a response that feels comfortable for you and also just shows that you don't get faced by these kinds of situations. My final tip would be to bring a question. At the end of your interviews, they're usually going to go to you, do you have any questions? And it's kind of nice to bring something that isn't just,
when are we going to find out the outcome of this interview?
It doesn't have to be anything particularly fancy, exciting, or sophisticated. Maybe it's just something that you genuinely really want to know. But remember, this is your last opportunity to leave a positive, final impression on your interviewers, so it's good to come with a little something prepared. Right, those are my top 10 tips. Those were my pearls of wisdom. I hope you enjoyed them. I hope you found it useful. If you have any tips or suggestions, please do share them in the comments section below. Now, I know that interviews are incredibly stressful, but remember, if you have been invited along to one, that is the interviewers swiping right for you. They like the look of your application. They've seen your experience, they've seen your qualifications, and they think that you could be perfect for the job. So do your practice, do your preparation, and just think about it as an opportunity to show them what you've got. Now, I know you're going to be fantastic. So best of luck, and I hope to speak to you next week. See ya! And by this I mean have a bit of a think about the things that you would... hell, Miranda.
My advice to you would be to get your
Emil,
house
don't be like that, because I don't respond well to that.
To what?
To that, 5, 10, 15, I don't need that right now.
All I was just doing was repeating what you were saying. See if I could do it. You know, that sort of thing.
Great, what's that gonna do? Maybe you have a pal in finance that you could potentially... My next tip would be to stop speaking. When you're asked a question in the nicest possible way, just shut your mouth.